Listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you has been buried in sealed archives and whispered behind locked doors for nearly 2 centuries. You were never meant to hear this. In the frozen pre-dawn hours of January 12, 1834, an entire community of over 300 souls vanished into the Kentucky darkness without so much as a footprint left behind. Not a single body was recovered. Not a single witness ever confessed. To this day, Pleasant Hill remains an unmarked grave of unanswered questions. Locals say if you stand in the ruined meeting house before dawn, you'll hear the hymns of the disappeared, hundreds of voices trapped in an endless chorus of obedience. But their story isn't just a tragedy, it is a template. A demonstration of how power operates when no one is watching, how belief can be weaponized to enslave, and how corruption masquerades as virtue until the very last heartbeat. The Pleasant Hill Shaker settlement was held up as a shining example of communal piety. Men in suits and women in bonnets sold their worldly possessions to join what they believed was a sacred experiment in equality and spiritual perfection. But beneath every hymn, every candlelit prayer circle, lay an invisible architecture of psychological domination so complete that even when the walls began to close in, almost no one tried to run. If you think this is just history, you are already mistaken. Because the same machinery of compliance they perfected in Kentucky has never stopped. It simply put on a different uniform. The story you're about to hear will strip away your illusions about the innocence of institutions and the safety of faith. You will learn how a single family transformed a settlement into a laboratory of coercion, how they engineered absolute submission with a combination of deprivation, ritual, and the kind of subtle violence that leaves no visible bruise. Ask yourself, what would it take to make you surrender your identity, your doubts, your freedom? What combination of devotion and dread would finally break you? By the time this story is over, you'll understand exactly why no one ever left Pleasant Hill alive, and why the techniques used there have never really disappeared. Stay with me. Because once you hear what happened, you will never see your leaders, or yourself, the same way again. When the first settlers arrived in Pleasant Hill in 1807, the land itself seemed touched by providence. Rich black soil unfurled in every direction, promising abundance to those willing to surrender their worldly attachments. It was here that Samuel Richardson, a man whose name you will not find in the state's official histories, declared himself anointed by the same divine authority that guided Mother and Lee, the Shaker's original prophetess. He carried no official charter, no proof of ordination, only a voice that could bend the will of the most hardened skeptic. And bend it he did. They came from Ohio and Pennsylvania, Tennessee and Virginia. Farmers, widows, failed merchants. Each one desperate for meaning, ready to exchange their independence for the promise of salvation in communal life. The moment they passed beneath the carved wooden arch that marked Pleasant Hill's entrance, their names were recorded by Sister Patience Richardson, Samuel's youngest daughter and the community's scribe. But those records were never sent to Shaker headquarters in New York. They were locked in a cedar chest, hidden under the floorboards of the meeting house. From that first day, the Richardson family began building something far more sophisticated than a simple religious commune. They constructed a system of surveillance and psychological engineering so meticulous that even the most suspicious converts came to believe it was their own conscience accusing them. Brother Caleb Richardson, Samuel's eldest son, oversaw this invisible apparatus. He personally appointed a cadre of enforcers, pious young men and women trained to eavesdrop on every whispered doubt, every moment of hesitation. If you spoke of leaving, you were summoned for spiritual counseling. If you asked too many questions, you were given a regimen of fasting and isolation. If you persisted, you vanished. At night, the community gathered in the long meeting house to sing hymns and confess their failures. Samuel stood at the front, bathed in the flickering light of dozens of oil lamps, his eyes scanning the faces for any flicker of defiance. When he spoke, his voice was velvet and iron intertwined, promising redemption, warning of annihilation. To the outside world, Pleasant Hill appeared a haven of peace and order. But in truth, it was a proving ground for how quickly a human being could be remade into a compliant vessel if you applied the right sequence of fear, hope, and deprivation. And the Richardson family documented every detail, every confession, every punishment, every disappearance, in ledgers that would never see daylight again. You need to understand something critical before we go further. No one at Pleasant Hill believed they were captives. That is how perfect the deception was. The Richardson family did not build walls of brick and iron. They built walls inside the mind. They used ritual to erase private thought, used confession to drain resistance, used hunger and sleeplessness to break the last, fragile strands of independence. And all of it was sanctified under the guise of spiritual purification. Every morning at precisely 4:30, Brother Caleb rang the iron bell that hung from a sycamore limb beside the meeting house. Its tolling could be heard for miles. To outsiders, it was simply the call to worship. But for those inside, it was the summons to submit. The day began in absolute silence. Members dressed by candlelight in plain linen garments, heads bowed, eyes fixed to the floor. Speaking before breakfast was forbidden, a small but potent act of control. They called it the hour of humility. After a meager meal, always prepared by Sister Hannah Collins, whose knowledge of herbs and tinctures was more dangerous than anyone guessed, the community dispersed to their labors. Some worked the fields, some the workshops. Others, like Sister Rebecca, administered the indoctrination of new converts. She could unmake a man in less than a month, dismantling his sense of self with a mixture of flattery and relentless correction until he no longer trusted a single thought unapproved by the family. By sunset, bodies were exhausted, minds softened. It was in this state of fatigue that Samuel delivered his nightly sermons, sermons that never spoke of individual salvation but of collective destiny. You were not a man or woman anymore. You were a cell in the sacred body of Pleasant Hill. To question the body was to commit a spiritual treason that could not be forgiven. It was during one of these evening gatherings that the first true rebellion flickered to life. A young woman named Sister Ruth Collins, no relation to Hannah, stood trembling as she confessed a sin no one had dared to name aloud, the desire to see her family again, to walk in the world beyond the farm. For a moment, the room went utterly still. Samuel closed his eyes as if in grief. When he opened them, they were bright with something darker than sorrow. Sister Ruth, he intoned, you are not ready to be free of your earthly attachments. You will enter the retreat. That was the last time anyone in Pleasant Hill heard her voice, the retreat. That word became a whispered threat among the inner ranks of Pleasant Hill. Outwardly, it sounded harmless, restorative even. A place of solitude, of prayer, of reconnection with divine purpose. But those who were sent there were never the same. And some were never seen again. The retreat cabin stood deep in the outer woods, where the trees grew so thick they blotted out the sun. There were 5 of them, each spaced half a mile apart, deliberately built beyond the reach of wandering eyes. Brother Jeremiah Richardson oversaw their construction. They were plain on the outside, wooden walls, no windows, a single iron bolt on the door, controlled from the outside. Inside, they were designed for isolation. 1 stool. 1 cot. 1 hymnal. No mirror. No clock. Sister Ruth Collins was taken there the night after her confession. 2 brothers walked her down the southern path by lantern light. She didn't resist. No one did, at first. The language of the community made resistance feel like betrayal. But the next morning, when Brother Ezekiel came to check the perimeter, he found claw marks on the inside of the door. Ruth remained in the retreat for 10 days. She was fed once a day. Spoken to only through scripture. Deprived of sleep, time, warmth. Her only contact was with Sister Martha Richardson, who visited daily to lead prayer and administer herbal treatments, substances designed to induce hallucinations and physical weakness. This wasn't healing. It was psychological dismemberment. When Ruth emerged, her eyes no longer met anyone's gaze. She spoke only when spoken to. She no longer asked about her family. She no longer asked anything. The Richardsons praised her as an example of spiritual victory. But to those who had known her, especially young Sister Mary Caldwell, it was like seeing a body with no one inside. Mary began to understand then, this wasn't just about devotion. It was about control. About reshaping the human soul into something pliant, obedient, and empty. A template of flesh the family could program with doctrine and fear. The retreat cabins became a quiet part of life at Pleasant Hill. Members would be taken away for days, sometimes weeks. Some returned altered. Some were never seen again. Always with the same explanation, they were called home by the Lord. No funerals. No graves. Just silence. And the fear that next time, it could be you. If you have ever wondered how entire populations can be subdued without chains or guns, look no further than Pleasant Hill. The Richardsons understood something that most men will never grasp: you don't have to kill the body if you can conquer the mind. And once you learn how to do it, you can replicate the process anywhere, whether in a commune, a corporation, or a government. By 1815, the system was perfected. Every new arrival was carefully observed from the moment they stepped onto the property. Where their eyes lingered during prayer. Whether they resisted the daily schedule. How they reacted to hunger, to correction, to isolation. Sister Rebecca maintained what she called the Book of Tendencies, a leather ledger cataloging each member's strengths, vulnerabilities, and potential for dissent. It was cross-referenced weekly with reports from Brother Caleb's surveillance detail. If someone seemed too independent, they were given extra labor to exhaust them. If they still held on to outside attachments, their letters were intercepted and rewritten before delivery. If they persisted in questioning the leadership's authority, they were marked for retreat. And if even the retreat failed to erase their resistance, they disappeared. Local authorities never investigated. Why would they? Samuel Richardson had cultivated their goodwill for years. Each autumn, wagons loaded with produce and fine furniture were delivered as donations to county officials and churches. Sheriff Morrison himself was a regular guest at the Pleasant Hill Harvest Feast, praising the community as a beacon of moral purity. The Richardsons knew exactly how to feed a man's pride, and blind his judgment. Inside the community, the rituals grew darker. Public confessions became more frequent and more humiliating. Members were required to recount the most intimate details of their lives, their doubts, their desires. These testimonies were recorded by sister patients in precise detail. They became leverage, a storehouse of secrets that could be used to silence even the most restless soul. This is how a man loses himself. Not all at once, but by 1,000 small concessions. By surrendering privacy. By submitting to surveillance. By allowing another to define your reality. Ask yourself, how many of those concessions have you already made in your own life? How much of your independence have you traded away without realizing the cost? Stay with me. Because the further you follow this descent, the more you will see your own reflection in the dark glass of Pleasant Hill. By 1820, the Pleasant Hill community had become a closed ecosystem of control so complete that most members could no longer imagine life beyond its fences. Every day was scripted. Every thought monitored. Even dreams were subject to interrogation. If you spoke in your sleep, there was always someone listening. Brother Caleb developed a network of informants, selected for their loyalty and fear, who reported weekly on any deviation from prescribed behavior. These reports were delivered directly to Samuel and Martha during their evening councils, where decisions were made about who would be corrected, who would be isolated, and who would be called home by the Lord. It was in these councils that the family first discussed the doctrine of removal, a secret policy never spoken aloud beyond the leadership circle. According to this doctrine, any member whose influence threatened the collective obedience of the whole was not merely to be disciplined but erased. Their memory, their possessions, even the record of their existence. Over time, this quiet eradication claimed dozens. The first documented victim of the doctrine was Brother David Price, a schoolteacher from Lexington who had joined Pleasant Hill with his wife and 2 children. David was well-liked, intelligent, and deeply pious, but he made the fatal mistake of questioning why so many members who entered the retreat never returned. He asked this question publicly, in the middle of evening prayers. For a moment, Samuel only looked at him, hands folded, eyes half closed. Witnesses said the stillness was worse than any outburst. Finally, Samuel nodded. And in that gesture, Brother David sealed his fate. 3 nights later, Caleb and Ezekiel came to his dormitory and escorted him away in silence. His wife was told he had been moved to a separate retreat for special purification. Weeks passed. No word. No letters. When she tried to ask again, Sister Martha took her gently by the arm and said, "Your husband has transcended worldly concerns. You must prepare your heart to release him." David Price was never seen again. His children were reassigned to other families within the commune. His name was scratched out of the membership records. His teaching materials burned in the main hearth. To the outside world, he had simply left. But inside Pleasant Hill, everyone knew the truth without daring to speak it. The Richardsons had perfected a method for disappearing a human being so thoroughly, it was as if he had never been born. Pause a moment. Let this sink in. Because the techniques developed in those dark Kentucky woods did not vanish when the buildings collapsed. They evolved, refined by every generation of men who would rather rule in secret than share power in the light. By 1824, the doctrine of removal was no longer an exception, it had become a policy of quiet terror that kept the entire population in line. No written record of it survived the destruction of Pleasant Hill's archives, but in 1937, a bundle of unsigned letters surfaced in a private collection in Louisville. In them, an anonymous former member described the ritual by which a person was erased. First came the summoning. At dusk, 2 members of the Richardson inner circle approached the target in silence. They were never violent. They never raised their voices. They simply laid a hand on your shoulder and said, "You are called." Those 3 words were enough to shatter the strongest resolve. Then came the procession. You were led through the rows of dormitories, past faces that dared not look up, across the gardens whose order and beauty mocked your impending oblivion. Some wept. Some prayed. Some tried to run. None succeeded. At the retreat, you were given a single opportunity to confess whatever doubts or grievances had brought you to this threshold. This was not an act of mercy. It was a final harvest of your secrets, information that would be used to manipulate those you left behind. Sister Patience recorded every word in her ledger, binding you to the system even in the hour of your erasure. And finally came the silence. The door closed. The bolt dropped. No more light, no more voices. In that darkness, something inside you began to disintegrate. Those who returned, if they returned, were changed. Their eyes were vacant. Their speech mechanical. One observer called them shells of devotion, vessels emptied of will and refilled with Richardson doctrine. But many never emerged at all. When neighbors asked about the missing, Samuel would smile with patient sorrow. They were not strong enough to remain among us, he would say. They chose the world over the kingdom. This explanation, repeated over and over, became an unassailable truth. Think about that. A lie, told often enough, becomes stronger than any evidence. That same principle has been used in every era to justify the most unspeakable acts, from inquisitions to purges to wars dressed up as liberation. I want you to understand, Pleasant Hill was not an anomaly. It was a proving ground. A case study in the anatomy of obedience. The only reason you haven't heard this story before is that the machinery it tested was too effective to discard. Stay alert. Because the deeper we go, the more you'll see that the techniques perfected here never really ended. By 1827, Pleasant Hill had become a kingdom in miniature, an invisible monarchy masquerading as a democracy of faith. Every decision, every punishment, every disappearance radiated from the same cold center, Samuel Richardson's conviction that the individual must be dissolved into the collective. And to maintain that illusion, the family needed something more potent than fear alone. They needed devotion so consuming that even the most brutal control could be justified as love. So they perfected the ritual of rebirth. Outsiders were told it was a ceremony of spiritual renewal, an initiation to cleanse members of worldly attachments. But those who endured it knew it for what it truly was, psychological obliteration. Once a month, all members gathered in the meeting house after sundown. The doors were barred from the inside. The lamps were dimmed until only the pulpit glowed in the darkness. Samuel would stand with his hands raised as if receiving power from above. Sister Martha moved silently among the rows, studying every face for any flicker of doubt or resentment. The ritual began with confession. One by one, members stood to recite their failings, envy, pride, longing for the outside world. Each admission was met not with comfort, but with a chorus of voices declaring, "Die to self." As the hours passed, exhaustion and shame dissolved whatever boundaries remained inside the human mind. Then came the circle of witnesses. The accused stood in the center while the others surrounded them, reciting scripture in a low, rhythmic chant. The effect was hypnotic. Some collapsed sobbing. Others fell into a trance so deep they had to be carried out. In that state, stripped of dignity, stripped of defenses, the Richardsons planted new beliefs like seeds in tilled earth. You are nothing without us. You are nothing without us. You are nothing without us. And after hours of repetition, the body began to believe what the conscious mind had resisted. This was no mere religious observance. It was a demonstration of power so total that the victims came to love their captors. They clung to the very hands that broke them, convinced there was no safety beyond the family's control. If you think yourself immune, consider how easily modern institutions use the same blueprint. Endless confession of your flaws. Ritual humiliation disguised as growth. Surveillance disguised as protection. You've seen it in corporations, in governments, in communities that promise belonging, always at the price of your autonomy. The only difference is that in Pleasant Hill, they did not pretend you were free. They simply made you grateful for your cage. There was a moment, brief as a heartbeat, when it all could have unraveled. In the autumn of 1828, a traveling inspector named Elijah Grant arrived from Ohio, tasked with evaluating the community's finances on behalf of distant investors. He was not a man easily impressed by piety. Nor was he blind to the subtle signs of fear that hung over Pleasant Hill like a storm cloud ready to break. From the moment he stepped onto the property, the Richardsons tried to envelop him in their careful theater. Samuel greeted him at the gate, a vision of serene authority in immaculate white linen. Sister Martha offered warm bread and soft-spoken assurances that all accounts were in perfect order. Brother Ezekiel conducted him through the workshops and fields, reciting rehearsed figures that never wavered. But Elijah Grant had made his living reading between the lines of ledgers. And it didn't take him long to see the cracks. The production totals were inflated. The profits overstated. More troubling still were the unexplained discrepancies in membership rolls. Nearly 70 names appeared in the records but not in the flesh. When he asked about them, Samuel's gaze did not flicker. Those brothers and sisters were called to higher service, he said, voice smooth as glass. Their absence is a sign of God's will. Grant made careful notes, never revealing how much he already suspected. At night, in his rented room in Harrodsburg, he documented every inconsistency in a journal he kept hidden beneath the floorboards. He began to see the outline of something monstrous, a system that erased lives not by accident but by design. On his third day, he was invited to evening worship. He accepted. What he witnessed confirmed his darkest suspicions. In the wavering lamplight, the entire community knelt, heads bowed. Samuel spoke of sacrifice and the necessity of surrendering all earthly attachments. Then, one by one, members began to confess their thoughts of escape. Not in whispers, but in flat, practiced voices. Each confession was greeted with murmurs of approval. It was not humility. It was submission performed as spectacle. Afterward, Grant tried to speak with Sister Ruth Collins, whose hollow stare had unsettled him more than any ledger. But Brother Caleb interposed himself, his hand resting lightly on Grant's shoulder, just enough pressure to make the message clear. That night, as he prepared to leave, Grant found a scrap of parchment slipped under his door. 4 words, scrawled in a shaking hand, "Help us. Please leave." He did leave. But he took his journal with him, a record that would one day survive the destruction of Pleasant Hill itself. Ask yourself, what would you have done, standing in that place where faith and fear were indistinguishable? Elijah Grant's departure was like the first fissure in a dam, silent, almost invisible, but destined to widen until no power could hold it back. Though he left without confrontation, the Richardsons understood what his silence meant. They had been observed by a man who saw through their benevolence to the machinery beneath. For weeks afterward, the atmosphere inside Pleasant Hill tightened to a degree that even the most obedient souls could feel. Sister Martha began conducting unannounced inspections of the dormitories, rifling through personal effects in search of journals or hidden correspondence. Brother Caleb increased his patrols, often appearing at odd hours in doorways or at windows, his face expressionless in the lantern light. But the greatest shift came in Samuel himself. His sermons, once a blend of sternness and paternal warmth, grew colder. He no longer spoke of salvation. He spoke of betrayal. Over and over, he reminded the congregation that the outside world was watching, waiting to tear them apart, to poison their faith. He described the inspector as an agent of Satan, come to scatter the flock. And it worked. Fear is the mortar of every totalitarian structure. Those who might have harbored private doubts found themselves clinging more desperately to the Richardsons, convinced that to leave was to be devoured by an invisible enemy. One evening, as the wind battered the meeting house and the candles sputtered in their iron sconces, Samuel ordered a special assembly. Every member was required to attend. Those too sick to walk were carried in. Standing before them, his hands clasped behind his back, Samuel began to read a list of names. 57 in all. Each belonged to a brother or sister who had disappeared over the previous 2 decades, some sent to the retreat, others simply gone without explanation. As he recited each name, a low chant began to rise from the congregation, they were not ready. They were not ready. When the last name had faded into the shadows, Samuel looked out over the bowed heads and spoke words that would haunt those who survived him. If any among you speak to outsiders of our sacred work, you will join them. In that instant, the unthinkable became possible. Not because of violence, though violence was always implied, but because the Richardsons had finally convinced the people of Pleasant Hill that their lives had meaning only within the prison they had built together. Remember this. The most enduring forms of control do not chain the body. They chain the spirit, until freedom itself feels like ASIN. It was in the winter of 1829 that Sister Mary Caldwell, whose silent observations had catalogued every horror, finally resolved to escape. For years, she had watched the slow erasure of her friends. She had seen the retreat cabins become tombs. She had heard the prayers that sounded more like curses. But it was the night of the 57 names that broke whatever spell remained. She knew she could not run openly. No one ever left Pleasant Hill without sanction. The roads were watched. The nearest town was a day's walk through hills that offered little cover from pursuit. And if she were caught, her fate would be certain, confession, isolation, and then, nothing. So she began the slow work of vanishing in plain sight. She made herself smaller in the daily rituals. She stopped asking questions. She gave Sister Martha no reason to suspect her thoughts were anything but loyal. When confession came, she offered only the blandest admissions, pride in her knitting, impatience with her fatigue. Meanwhile, she began to collect supplies, a crust of bread saved from each meal, a coil of twine pilfered from Brother Jeremiah's workshop, a scrap of tallow candle hidden beneath a loose floorboard. She studied the patrols until she could recite them by heart. One night in late January, as the wind screamed through the trees and the bell tower groaned like an old ship, she slipped from her bed. She did not look back. That was the first rule of escaping a psychological prison: never allow sentiment to slow your hand. She crossed the southern fields, moving from one shadow to the next, her breath pluming in the frozen dark. At the edge of the property, she paused. The main gate stood only 30 paces away, its latch no more than a simple iron bar. But she knew that to cross it was to step beyond everything she had been taught to believe about herself, her purpose, her worth. The final barrier wasn't the gate itself. It was the voice in her mind, whispering that she would die alone if she left. She stepped over it anyway. At dawn, Brother Caleb discovered her empty bed. The search began immediately, hounds, riders, lanterns sweeping the snow. But by then, she had slipped into the forest, where no doctrine could follow. She would never return. And in the months ahead, her testimony would become the first light cast upon Pleasant Hill's hidden atrocities. But even her escape could not save the others who remained, nor undo the decades of silent terror the Richardsons had perfected. Mary Caldwell's escape was the first true crack in Pleasant Hill's walls, but inside the community, her absence was treated as blasphemy. In the next Sabbath assembly, Samuel Richardson did not even speak her name. Instead, he stood in the pulpit, hands folded, eyes closed, as the congregation knelt before him. He began to pray aloud, not to God, but over the people themselves. His voice was soft at first, almost tender, describing how the devil would come wearing the face of someone familiar. How doubt spread like rot in a harvest bin. How the righteous must amputate corruption to preserve the body. Sister Martha then rose and spoke with the gentle calm she used before a punishment. Any who hold her memory in your hearts, confess now. No one did. No one dared. But they all felt the net tightening. That week, every member was interrogated separately. Where had they seen Sister Mary last? Had she spoken of leaving? Had she offered any sign that she was unworthy? Even the children were questioned, small, bewildered faces pressed against the cold wooden tables while Brother Ezekiel demanded their recollections. Some confessed things that were never true, just to end the questions. Others wept silently, unable to summon any defense. In those confessions, the Richardsons found the justification they needed. 6 names were called in the next assembly, brothers and sisters who were said to have harbored rebellion. They were led away under the guise of spiritual retreat. Most were never seen again. That is how control renews itself. It does not rest when it is threatened. It doubles its vigilance, tightens the screws, demands new sacrifices. And those sacrifices become proof of its righteousness. Outside the commune, Mary reached Harrodsburg half-frozen, her feet blistered and bleeding. She told her story to a local merchant, who fetched the sheriff. For the first time in decades, there was an official inquiry. Deputies were dispatched to Pleasant Hill, carrying orders to inspect records and speak with members privately. When the deputies arrived, they found the community in perfect order. The gardens immaculate, the workshops bustling, the members calm and compliant. Every question was met with the same gentle assurances: we are blessed. We are united. We have nothing to hide. And when they asked about the missing, Samuel smiled as if offering a prayer: they are no longer with us. No charges were filed. No arrests made. The deputies left convinced the rumors were just that, rumors. And so, the machine rolled on, greased by fear and protected by the conviction that no one would ever believe the truth. Stay with me. Because you must understand, this story is not about one vanished woman. It is about the ease with which entire communities can be seduced into silence, simply because their jailers have learned to speak in the language of faith. By 1830, the boundaries between spiritual devotion and psychological domination at Pleasant Hill were no longer blurred, they were obliterated. The Richardsons had crossed a threshold that most cults only flirt with. They were no longer shaping beliefs. They were shaping reality. Inside the community, members no longer spoke of the outside world. Children born within the commune never even heard of cities like Lexington or Louisville. Names of family members were forbidden in daily speech. Photographs, trinkets, anything from before, all confiscated, burned, or buried. Samuel called it the final purity. He preached that the soul could not ascend while carrying the dead weight of earthly memory. Every Sunday, members stood one by one to destroy the last fragments of their former lives. A child's ribbon. A father's pocket watch. A letter from a sibling who had begged them to come home. They burned it all in the hearth of the meeting house while chanting, "This world is no longer mine. This name is no longer mine. This will is no longer mine." It was a ritual of identity erasure. And it worked. People began to refer to themselves only in the third person, using titles assigned by the Richardsons. Sister Hope. Brother Loyalty. Even their birth names were removed from the rolls. By this point, the original members who remembered life before Pleasant Hill were too broken or too afraid to speak. And those who remained had been born into obedience, like animals bred in a cage too small to imagine open sky. But outside the commune, rumors began to circulate again. Mary Caldwell's testimony, ignored at first, was picked up by an Ohio abolitionist society, which took special interest in the accusations of forced labor and psychological abuse. They published a pamphlet titled "The Quiet Chains of Pleasant Hill," which circulated throughout Kentucky, reaching even lawmakers in Frankfort. For the first time, the myth of Pleasant Hill as a model community was under threat. State officials called for a second investigation, this time with an independent inspector from Cincinnati. A date was set. A formal visit would occur in April of 1834. Inside Pleasant Hill, Samuel Richardson convened an emergency gathering of the inner circle. For hours, they spoke in hushed tones, weighing what must be hidden, what must be destroyed, and who among them might betray the cause. Martha suggested a cleansing, not of property, but of people. They had done it before, one by one. Now, she proposed, they do it all at once. In the flickering candlelight of the meeting house, Samuel's answer came like the crack of thunder, "Then we prepare the exodus." Not a retreat. Not a surrender. An ending. One that no outsider would understand, and none inside would survive. When dawn came after that fateful council, the community looked unchanged, orderly rows of whitewashed buildings, gardens glistening with dew, smoke curling from the chimneys. But in the hearts of the Richardson family, a grim resolution had settled like a black frost. They called it the Exodus, but it was never meant as escape. It was annihilation disguised as deliverance. A final act to ensure that no fragment of their kingdom, no evidence, no witness, could be turned against them by the world they had so long despised. In the weeks that followed, preparations unfolded under the guise of revival. Daily worship services doubled in length. Members were encouraged to fast, to purify the body for the great journey. The retreat cabins were cleaned and stocked, not for confession, but for something far darker. Sister Martha drafted the final records, ledgers that would explain the sudden absence of hundreds as a voluntary migration to new Shaker settlements farther west. No such settlements existed. The names on those lists were already as good as dead. Brother Caleb took responsibility for what Samuel called the logistical necessities. Barrels of tinctures were prepared, herbal compounds potent enough to sedate a person beyond resistance. Some believed they were medicine. Others guessed the truth but said nothing. This is what happens when obedience becomes survival. You learn to deny your own eyes, because to see clearly is to choose between complicity and death. On the first night of April, a storm broke over the hills, rain thrashing the meeting house in sheets. Samuel summoned the entire community to gather. He stood in the pulpit, face illuminated by a single lantern, and spoke in a voice that no longer pretended to be kind. "Tonight," he said, "we return our lives to the source of all creation. We leave behind the corruption of the world. We leave behind the weakness of flesh. We leave behind the fear that has been sown among us." As he spoke, Martha and Caleb moved through the congregation, offering cups of warm liquid. Members took them without question. Some wept, believing they were about to be saved. Some sat in numb silence, unable to resist the tide that had swept away every trace of self. Outside, thunder rolled across the fields. Inside, the last light flickered on faces pale with resignation. It is said that when the inspector arrived 2 days later, he found no sign of struggle. Beds were neatly made. Tables set for meals that would never be eaten. Every building empty, save for the bodies laid out in perfect rows, hands folded over chests, as if asleep. 300 souls vanished not into the wilderness, but into the abyss the Richardsons had promised was heaven. If you think this could never happen again, you have not been paying attention. When the Cincinnati inspector, Henry Walcott, stepped through the main gate on April 3, 1834, he expected resistance, a locked door, an armed guard, perhaps even a legal standoff. What he found instead was silence so profound that his own heartbeat seemed like an offense against it. The meeting-house door stood ajar, swaying gently in the wind. He called out, but no voice answered. He stepped inside. There, arrayed in perfect formation, were rows upon rows of bodies. Men, women, even children, every face composed in that terrible semblance of peace. The air smelled of damp wool, cold ashes, and something sweeter, like overripe fruit. He crossed the room slowly, unwilling to believe what he was seeing. In each hand lay a folded scrap of parchment. The same words, over and over, "We go freely. We go together. We go to meet the divine." He thought he would be sick. As Walcott moved from building to building, the pattern repeated. Dormitories filled with the dead. Kitchens, workshops, storage rooms, every space abandoned by the living, yet arranged with almost ceremonial precision. There were no signs of panic. No overturned chairs. No claw marks at the door. Only a stillness that felt orchestrated. When the authorities arrived later that day, they began the grim work of recording and removing the remains. The official reports described mass voluntary departure from life, but even the most pious investigator could see the truth. This was no spontaneous act of devotion. It was a conclusion written long before the final sermon was ever preached. Among the records Martha had prepared, Walcott found ledgers cataloging every possession, every transaction, every soul. The final entry, penned in her immaculate hand, read simply, "Nothing remains." And in a sense, that was true. Nothing remained of the individuals who had once dreamed of salvation in those fields. No trace of the doubts that might have freed them. No protest. No witness. Only the machinery of control, perfectly executed to its last function. Even as officials packed away evidence, the story began to transform. Newspapers called it a tragedy of religious excess. Some called it martyrdom. Others insisted it was mass hysteria. But none of them were willing to face the darker truth. This was what happens when human beings surrender their sovereignty, inch by inch, to a cause that demands everything. This is why you must never dismiss the signs of creeping domination, whether they appear in a congregation, a corporation, or a government. Because submission rarely comes as an edict. It comes as 100 small choices to stop thinking for yourself. Remember this moment. Because one day, you will be asked to trade your judgment for the comfort of belonging. And on that day, you must choose whether you will stand alone in your uncertainty, or lay yourself down in neat rows with the others who chose silence. When the last bodies were buried, and the last ledgers sealed away in the Kentucky archives, Pleasant Hill seemed to fade from public memory. The site was left to rot, buildings collapsing under their own weight, weeds crawling through every cracked floorboard. But what the newspapers never printed, what even the investigators dared not say, was that something remained behind. Something intangible but potent. A kind of psychic residue. A darkness that seeped into the walls and the earth itself. In the decades that followed, travelers who strayed onto the property told of strange sensations. A heaviness in the chest. A feeling of being watched by eyes that were no longer human. Even hardened Civil War scouts, men who had survived Antietam and Shiloh, avoided camping near the ruins. They spoke of voices drifting through the night air, voices chanting words no one could understand. Some insisted the place was cursed, that the mass death had opened a doorway to something older and more ravenous than any god the Richardsons claimed to serve. Others believed it was merely guilt echoing back through time, a monument to human weakness carved invisibly into the land. But I want you to consider something far more unsettling. What if it wasn't supernatural at all? What if the power that lingered in Pleasant Hill was simply the distilled essence of psychological surrender, generation upon generation of souls trained to lay down their will? What if that kind of submission leaves an imprint, like a brand burned into the collective mind? Think about it. If the memory of a place can infect the living, if the echo of one community's collapse can still provoke fear almost 200 years later, then the real terror isn't in ghosts. The real terror is that the method worked so perfectly it transcended death itself. This is why I'm telling you these things, not to entertain you with horror, but to arm you. Because this kind of control is not confined to history. It is alive right now. You can see it in every institution that demands your unthinking loyalty. Every movement that asks you to surrender your individuality for the promise of belonging. Every voice that says your doubts make you the enemy. Pleasant Hill is a ruin now. But the idea that built it, that worship and fear can be merged into a single force, never died. And if you are not vigilant, you will find yourself chanting words you never believed, surrendering freedoms you didn't know you had lost, until you wake up in your own quiet rows. If you have stayed with me this far, I want you to prove you are awake. Comment this phrase below, I see through the veil. Say it twice to claim your own mind. Because the first step out of any prison is to declare that you recognize the bars, even as the story of Pleasant Hill was scrubbed from polite conversation, a few survivors, men who had supplied goods to the commune, distant cousins who'd visited once or twice, could never quite shake the suspicion that what happened there was not an isolated tragedy but part of something older and deeper. In the years that followed, investigators trying to untangle the Richardsons' finances found traces of their network stretching far beyond Kentucky. Seed shipments that never arrived. Furniture sold under false names. Donations to phantom congregations across the Ohio River Valley. It was as if the family had woven a hidden economy beneath the surface of the Shaker movement, one that funneled wealth, influence, and eventually human lives into their singular purpose. But here is what the official records never dared to ask: what was that purpose, truly? Was it greed? Certainly, they enriched themselves beyond any reasonable need. But the longer you study the details, the more obvious it becomes: wealth was only a tool. Power, total, unanswerable power, was their true sacrament. The documents Martha left behind contain chilling glimpses of this obsession. Notes scribbled in the margins of sermons about the necessity of total submission. Inventory lists annotated with cryptic phrases like, willing to be remade, or, not yet compliant. Reports from Brother Caleb, describing in clinical detail how many days it took to break a convert's will. And then there were the letters, hidden in a false wall behind Martha's quarters, addressed to names that do not appear in any census, signed only with a symbol, a stylized I surrounded by 7 radiating lines. The letters spoke of Pleasant Hill as an experiment. A proving ground. One message contained this sentence: if we succeed here, the method can be replicated wherever men hunger for purpose. That is why I am telling you this in such detail. Because the danger was never in the isolated community itself, it was in the system they perfected. A psychological contagion designed to erase the self under the banner of salvation. Today, you can find the same tactics in more polished forms: charismatic leaders who demand absolute trust, institutions that exploit faith and fear in equal measure, entire cultures built around the annihilation of individual conscience. The only difference is that now, they do not need walls to keep you inside. They only need your consent to stop thinking for yourself. So remember Pleasant Hill not as a ghost story, but as a map, a template that will be used again and again, in every era, by those who understand that control is easier to sell when you call it devotion. Long after the last graves had sunken into the earth, the property passed quietly into the hands of state trustees. They fenced it, posted warnings, and declared it unfit for habitation. But there were always the curious, the ones who came in the dead of night, lanterns held high, hoping to glimpse something that would confirm the legends were true. Some were drawn by superstition, others by thrill-seeking. But a few came because they understood the deeper significance of what had happened there. Among them were scholars of cult behavior and psychologists who studied the mechanics of mass compliance. They walked the ruins with notebooks in hand, mapping the spaces where hundreds of people had chosen, or been compelled, to erase themselves. One of these researchers, Dr. Lionel Graves, spent a decade compiling witness accounts, ledgers, and correspondence. His notes were never published in any academic journal. Too controversial, he said. Too dangerous. But in the margins of his private papers, he wrote something that deserves to be spoken aloud. It was not the sermons that doomed them. Not the beatings, nor the hunger, nor the threats. It was the surrender of doubt. That was the first and final act of their undoing. Consider that carefully. Because doubt is the part of you that resists. The last spark that says, maybe this isn't right. Maybe I'm being lied to. The Richardsons understood that no system of control can flourish while even one mind retains the courage to question. So they built a machine designed to crush doubt in every form, through ritual, surveillance, and collective confession. This is why Pleasant Hill feels so alien, so monstrous. Not because it was a place of violence, though it was, but because it revealed how easily ordinary people can be turned into instruments of their own destruction. If you think yourself immune, look around you. Every day, subtle campaigns are waged for your loyalty. Algorithms feed you the ideas most likely to make you obedient. Comment sections swarm to enforce conformity. News outlets sell you a single perspective, repackaged as universal truth. And all the while, your doubts, your quiet, uncomfortable questions, are painted as moral failings. This is how Pleasant Hill happens again and again, in different costumes, wearing the masks of progress, religion, or community. If you ever wonder how hundreds of souls could line up to drink their own oblivion, remember this: it began with the belief that certainty was more sacred than truth. By 1850, just 16 years after the last heartbeat faded in Pleasant Hill, the land was overgrown, the roads to the commune swallowed by forest and forgetfulness. But the experiment wasn't over. Not really. In a dusty archive in Cincinnati, two state officials, Thomas Everly and Joseph Harmon, stumbled upon correspondence that would never make it into history textbooks. Among records from the 1834 investigation, they found a box of sealed letters addressed to religious leaders, educators, and physicians across the eastern seaboard. Letters written not by the state, but by Nathan Richardson. Each message followed a template, a tone of gentle inquiry, an invitation to discuss methods of spiritual refinement, and cryptic references to successful application of Phase 1. Phase 1. They didn't know what it meant, not at first. But the implication chilled them. Pleasant Hill had not been a self-contained delusion. It had been a prototype. Thomas, alarmed, tried to raise the alarm through proper channels. He brought the box to the State House in Frankfurt, but within 2 weeks, the documents were misplaced. His name vanished from active service within months, labeled erratic. Joseph tried to publish the letters anonymously through a regional newspaper. The article never ran. The editor retired suddenly. The silence that fell around Pleasant Hill became too precise to be accidental. Too methodical. That's when the whispers began, quiet rumors that other communities, other spiritual societies, had sprung up in Tennessee, in Indiana, in the outskirts of Pennsylvania. Always small. Always closed off. Always practicing similar rituals. Each one built on the bones of Shaker language, but twisted, corrupted into something colder. They never called themselves Richardsons. But they used the same phrases. The washing of memory. The surrender of worldly will. The final purity. And the same pattern followed each settlement, a charismatic core, a watchful silence, a missing person here or there, until one day, the building stood empty. No explanations. No survivors. Pleasant Hill was the beginning. Not the end. And if you think this is just an old tale, a strange piece of history with no relevance to your life, then ask yourself, why do modern institutions still use the same tools? Isolation. Indoctrination. Erasure of descent through shame or fear. This isn't a ghost story. This is the blueprint of psychological enslavement. And the only defense against it is vigilance that never sleeps. It is tempting to believe you would have been different, that if you'd stood in that meeting house as the storm raged outside, you would have seen through Samuel Richardson's lies. That you would have refused the cup, demanded the truth, broken ranks and run into the night. But history tells us otherwise. When the need to belong collides with the fear of isolation, most people will choose the safety of the group, even if it leads them to their own annihilation. The Richardsons did not invent this weakness. They simply perfected the ritual that exploited it. Consider the sequence. First, they offered purpose. A grand narrative that transformed suffering into virtue. Work all day. Starve yourself of desire. Cut ties with your family. That wasn't oppression, it was proof you were chosen. Second, they demanded confession. Night after night, members bared their doubts, their failings, their secret shames. Each confession eroded the self just a little more, until privacy itself was an obsolete idea. Third, they rewrote language. Ordinary words, love, duty, sacrifice, became code for compliance. Dissent became spiritual disease. Questioning was recast as betrayal. Finally, they severed escape. Physically, by closing gates. Psychologically, by making any departure a declaration of unworthiness. When every option outside the system is painted as failure, most people will convince themselves to stay, just to avoid the shame of exile. Tell me this, do you really think you are immune? When you see everyone around you repeating the same phrases, praising the same authorities, condemning the same enemies, do you have the courage to hold your own judgment? When the price of doubt is isolation, will you still choose to think? This is why Pleasant Hill matters. Not because it was uniquely wicked, but because it was so ordinary. It was built on the same hunger that lives in every human heart, the longing for certainty, the desire to be part of something larger, the terror of standing alone. And the truth that no one wants to admit is this: the Richardsons did not have to chain anyone to the floor. They only had to convince them that submission was holiness. Look around. This blueprint is alive in boardrooms, political movements, and even your digital communities. Never surrender your private doubts to the collective chorus. Because that is where every exodus begins, not with the poison in the cup, but with the silence in your own mind. After Pleasant Hill fell silent, generations passed before anyone dared to set foot inside the meeting house again. In 1901, a historian named Edwin Fairchild convinced himself that documenting the ruins would be a harmless exercise, just an academic project to satisfy his curiosity about Kentucky's hidden past. He brought with him a notebook, a camera, and a conviction that the stories were exaggerated. He was a man of reason, a skeptic. He believed that human beings were too rational to ever fall willingly into such darkness. But over the course of that winter, as he catalogued the property, Edwin began to understand how easy it was to underestimate the hunger that had devoured this place. He found the pulpit where Samuel Richardson had declared the final exodus. The wood was split from age, the lantern hooks rusted. But carved into the front, in careful letters, were words that had never appeared in any known sermon: the harvest of submission yields the seed of dominion. It struck Edwin that this was the creed of the Richardsons stripped of all its holy disguise. A single idea that had justified every theft, every cruelty, every calculated death. For days, he could not sleep. He kept returning to that phrase in his mind, understanding that what had happened at Pleasant Hill was not the product of one mad family, but the logical outcome of any system built on unquestioned obedience. When he finally left, Edwin wrote a letter to a colleague at the University of Chicago. It was never published, but it deserves to be read even now. The great mistake is believing that men like the Richardsons are anomalies. They are simply the ones who understood that people will trade freedom for certainty if you wrap the transaction in ritual and call it faith. They did not create the appetite. They only fed it. Ask yourself, in your own life, how often have you traded your judgment for the comfort of belonging? How many times have you silenced the question in your heart, simply because everyone around you agreed on an answer. You may think Pleasant Hill is safely buried in the past, but the pattern survives. It thrives wherever people are convinced that thinking for themselves is dangerous. That doubt is a sin. That compliance is a virtue. Remember this, every authoritarian system begins as a promise to relieve you of uncertainty. And the price is always the same, your will, your conscience, your very self. If you forget this, you will find yourself one day sitting in your own meeting house, hands folded, waiting for the cup you have convinced yourself must be salvation. There is a reason the authorities sealed so much of Pleasant Hill's record away in dusty archives and forbidden collections. A reason why most history books still reduce it to a footnote, an unfortunate episode of religious zealotry. Because to tell the story honestly would force every institution to reckon with a truth too dangerous to speak aloud. Human beings are not naturally free. They are naturally compliant. Freedom is an act of will that must be chosen, over and over, against the grain of our own instincts. When you look at the photographs Edwin Fairchild took, rows of beds perfectly made, tools laid out as if waiting for hands that would never return, you feel that hidden gravity. The pull toward surrender. The comfort of letting someone else decide who you are, what is right, when it's time to lay down your life. It would be easier to believe the Richardsons were monsters, a unique aberration. But they were simply the most disciplined expression of a temptation that has always existed, to turn your fear into devotion. To turn your devotion into obedience. To turn your obedience into annihilation. And the mechanism is not confined to religious cults. You see it in any system that preaches a totalizing ideology. Where every question is an attack. Every doubt a betrayal. Every refusal to conform, a declaration of war against the collective identity. That is why the study of Pleasant Hill matters. Not because it explains something about a single community, but because it reveals something about you. About every man who has ever felt the pull to belong so desperately he would trade the last shreds of his conscience to keep from standing alone. You think you would have walked away. Perhaps. But the real test is not whether you would have escaped Pleasant Hill in 1834. The real test is whether you can resist the same pattern today, when it is more sophisticated, disguised as patriotism, as moral progress, as social consensus. Wherever you find leaders who demand not your trust, but your submission, wherever you find rituals that demand not your participation, but your surrender, wherever you find a chorus that insists there is only one truth, and you must be purified to see it, you are standing on the threshold of your own Pleasant Hill. And it is in that moment that your fate will be decided. Will you drink the cup, or will you keep your mind your own? Before the last of the documents were locked away, a clerk named Jonathan Pike copied a single ledger page and hid it inside his coat. He was young, ambitious, and afraid. But something in the neat columns of names, dates, and annotations struck him as too important to consign to oblivion. At the top of the page was a heading in Martha Richardson's hand, Phase 1, Criteria for Final Selection. Below were nearly 300 names, every man, woman, and child who had vanished that night. Beside each, in an unwavering script, a single word repeated, willing. Not faithful. Not redeemed. Not chosen. Willing. Pike would later write in a private diary that this was the most terrifying word he had ever read. Because it meant the Richardsons had never expected to force compliance. They had merely engineered an environment so complete, so meticulously designed, that when the moment came, every person laid down their life as if it were the inevitable fulfillment of their own wish. I want you to understand what this means. The machinery of domination does not depend on overt terror alone. It thrives on ritual. On repetition. On the slow erosion of your ability to define reality without permission. Until finally, you cannot distinguish between your own conviction and the voice of those who command you. And once that boundary is dissolved, they do not have to threaten you. They only have to suggest what a good, worthy, righteous person would do. That is why Pleasant Hill was not an isolated horror. It was the demonstration of a universal principle, that submission can be made to feel voluntary. This is the hidden danger in every ideology that demands you submerge your identity in something larger. The more virtuous it seems, the more seductive it becomes. That is why the records were buried. Why the site was left to rot. Not to protect you from the memory of tragedy, but to protect the powerful from the exposure of their most effective tool, consent manufactured by the annihilation of doubt. When you look back on this moment, years from now, ask yourself if you still remember the ledger. The word beside each name. The single, chilling truth that control is most complete when it feels like your idea. Do not let them make you willing. There are men who will hear this story and laugh, who will insist that nothing like Pleasant Hill could happen now. That modern people are too sophisticated, too educated, too vigilant. But those men have never studied the way influence evolves. You see, the Richardsons needed fences and isolation because they lived in an age when ideas traveled slowly. But today, no perimeter is required. You carry the mechanisms of indoctrination in your own pocket, a screen that whispers to you all day, 100 voices shaping your perception of reality. Today, no cult leader needs to stand behind a pulpit. They appear in your feed, your timelines, your search results, telling you which ideas are permissible and which thoughts make you an enemy of decency itself. When Martha Richardson wrote, Phase 1, Criteria for Final Selection, she believed she was perfecting a method that would eventually be adopted by every institution that required unthinking compliance. And in a way, she was right. Because the principle has never changed. Whether it wears the robe of religion or the sleek mask of technology, the aim is always the same: break your capacity to question. Redefine your moral compass in the image of authority. Reward your surrender as evidence of virtue. And the final step, always the final step, is to make you believe that your submission is not a loss, but a triumph. I am not telling you this to frighten you. I am telling you this because every man must one day face the truth that he alone is responsible for the integrity of his mind. No institution, no ideology, no movement will ever love you enough to preserve your independence. That is a duty you must claim for yourself. Look around you. How many of your beliefs are genuinely yours? How many have been implanted, repeated, reinforced until you can no longer tell the difference between what you chose and what you were taught to want? This is your inheritance from Pleasant Hill, the proof that no amount of education or progress can immunize humanity against the desire to belong at any cost. But you are not doomed to repeat their fate. You are only doomed if you refuse to see the pattern when it re-emerges, shiny and modern, promising you safety, belonging, certainty. That is when you must be strongest. Because the moment you let them define what is true without your own examination, you have already begun your walk to the meeting house. This is where the trail of Pleasant Hill ends, or at least, where it disappears beneath the polite narratives of history. The buildings crumbled. The records vanished into restricted archives. And the story was reduced to folklore, a cautionary tale about religious extremism, safely quarantined in the past. But you, listening now, know better. You know that what happened in those hills was not an aberration but an unveiling. A glimpse into the machinery that has always operated behind the facades of noble purpose and sacred mission. And you must decide what to do with this knowledge. You can close this video and dismiss it as dark entertainment, a curiosity for late-night speculation. You can reassure yourself that you are too aware, too independent to ever fall into such a web. Or you can accept the harder truth, that every man, no matter how strong, carries within him the capacity to surrender his conscience if the right buttons are pressed, if the right fear is stoked, if the right promise is made. The Richardsons understood this with an instinctive clarity. They knew that all it took was the promise of purification, of purpose, of belonging, and a man would volunteer for his own undoing. So I will leave you with this: in the ledger of Phase 1, beside every name, was that single word, willing. If your life were laid out in such a ledger, what word would appear beside your name? Would it say willing? Or would it say unbroken? If you are still listening, you are not here by accident. This story is for the ones who suspect that something is wrong with the consensus they are fed, who feel that quiet, unspeakable suspicion that there are forces invested in their compliance. You are exactly who this was meant for. And now, before you go, I ask you to do one thing. Write this phrase in the comments twice, not once, but twice, to seal this understanding into your identity and to signal to the algorithm that you are not among the willing. I will not be remade. I will not be remade. Let the world see that there are still men who will not be broken, who will not trade doubt for comfort, who will not kneel when commanded to surrender the last refuge of their mind. Because in the end, the only true fortress is the one you build within yourself, a place where no authority can rewrite your perception, no ritual can erase your conscience, and no collective can claim your soul. Remember Pleasant Hill. Remember the ledger. And never, never, let them make you willing.